Where does the meaning of a poem come from? I'd like you to pause the video and think about that question for a little bit, because the answer you likely gave as your initial response is probably right, but only partly so. Because the meaning of a poem doesn't come from just one thing. And to highlight this, I'm going to read a poem that was published in Psychopoetica in 1995. And it's one that I wrote, so here it is. Personified. It is in the eye that I have found the beauty to behold. Now that's a short, simple poem, right? But what does it mean? Okay. To help you to figure that out, I'm going to put the poem on the screen so that you can look at it, just in case you thought the I that I referred to in this poem is this I, the one I see with, when it's actually not. So here is the poem. Now, when I asked my sister that question, she immediately responded, the reader, or in this case, the viewer. So if that's what you said, you're right up to a point. But there's two other aspects of the meaning of a poem. One is just the words of the poem. And one of the reasons I use this particular poem is because of that homophone, I, as in the thing I see with, and I, as in me, right? And if you thought that I was referring to the thing I see with, that completely changed the meaning of this poem. And if it is the I, me, that also changed the meaning of this poem. But there's other things that go along with that. For example, if you don't know English, I'm surprised you're watching this video, for one thing, but if you don't know English, then you're not going to understand the words being used in the poem, and those words are what carry the meaning of that poem to you. And so the reader can only apply meaning to a poem if they actually understand the language of that poem, what those words mean. Now, I'm not going to go into that with this poem because I'm not a dictionary. I'm a poet. And so that particular aspect of the meaning of the words that are used in a poem, you can use a dictionary to find that out, at least up to a point. Because poets like to play with words, they like to use them differently than most people do, they like to combine them in ways that are unusual and so forth, and that transforms the meaning of that poem. But what about this particular poem? There's two surface level meanings that you may or may not have gotten from this poem, because the meaning that you applied to it as the reader or viewer is limited by the experiences that you have had. And it changes from one reader or viewer to another. And so if we're looking at this poem and we have both of us, you and I, looking at the same poem, we're going to end up with different understandings of it, because we are relying upon our knowledge, our experiences, and so forth to interpret that poem. In this case, one reader who is familiar with that old saying, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, is going to read this poem, see this poem in a different way than someone who isn't familiar with that old saying. And so that carries meaning to this poem. And that meaning is, am I just playing with words here? Did I just take that old saying, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and just rearrange the words to call it a poem. It is in the eye that I have found the beauty to behold. Well, to a certain degree, yeah, that's what I did. I like wordplay like that. But there's more to it than that, at least for me as the poet. And that's where more of the meaning of a poem comes from. Because what a poem is doing is it's taking what the poet understands, translating it into language that is common to anyone who knows that language and understands those words, in order to convey to the reader of those words that meaning, if it's possible to do so. But the problem arises when the reader doesn't have the same knowledge and background and so forth that the poet does. And so the meaning of this poem to me, as the poet, is considerably different than the meaning that you are applying to it. So if we want to stop with this is a play on words, and you want to groan or laugh or just go, oh, that's fine. Because that's what the meaning of the poem is for you. But also on that surface level, we have an affirmation. It is in the I, so it's in me, that I have found the beauty to behold. So I am affirming in this poem that I am beautiful. Now, what makes me beautiful? What is it about me that is beautiful? Well, there again, we've got that subjective quality to this poem. Because if you're reading it and you apply the I to yourself, what is it about you that is beautiful in your own eyes? And yes, I did that intentionally with that play on words. Because what's beautiful in you will not be the same as what's beautiful in me from the perspective of the person who is viewing it. So this persona poem, it is in the I that I have found the beauty to behold. If you translate it to your particular self, you're going to develop a completely different meaning for this poem, because your I is different than the meaning that I give it, because my I is not yours. But it's a general concept as well, so we can both do that. We'll end up with two different meanings of this poem, but both are right, both are true, because poetry has that very strong subjective element to it. So, one aspect of the meaning comes from the words being used. Another aspect is how those words are understood. And that's where the reader and the poet both come into play. So how you understand those words is going to be derived from your experiences, your insights, your understanding of the language, and so forth. And so your meaning of this poem will be different from someone else's. And that's perfectly all right, because that's part of what poetry is about. It's trying to make individual connections between the poet and the reader. And in a lot of my poetry, I'm trying to make generalized connections that are common to pretty much all of us, which means that I don't really write a lot of contemporary poetry that focuses on concrete things that are intended to place the reader into the situation so they can experience the emotions with it. And so for me, poetry isn't really about sharing emotions in that way, even though some of my poetry is intended to do that, but rather, for me, poetry is about capturing the essential aspects of being human. At least some of my poetry is like that. This is one of those poems. It's trying to capture what that I is. And so if you thought that this poem was just a play on words or an affirmation, that's a perfectly legitimate understanding of the meaning of this poem. But what about the meaning this poem has for me? Well, the magazine that published it, Psychopoetica, is a clue because it published poetry that related to psychology. And so the audience of that magazine may have made the same connection to Freud that I had made when I wrote this poem. And it deals with the Freudian concepts of the id, the ego, and the superego. That ego is the I, and the id is that pleasure impulse, and the superego is basically the social constraints and mores and so forth that shape us. So, if you're familiar with Freudian concepts like those, then you can add another layer of a deeper meaning to this poem. That is where this came from. I was learning psychology. I ran across Freud. It reminded me of that old saying, and twisting the words of that old saying around led to this poem, which is a connection to the experiences of what I was learning at the time that I wrote it. And if you remember from the introduction to this channel, that's where a lot of my poems come from. My experiences, what I'm learning, and so forth. So this poem means something to me because it connects me to that past when I was learning about psychology for the first time. And that experience comes in to my meaning of this poem, but it's highly unlikely to come into your meaning of this poem. A little more likely for those who read the magazine Psychopoetica, because they already have a connection to psychology and can read a little deeper into the poem than someone who doesn't. Now, there is a darker side to this poem. When I graduated high school, I went into a major depressive episode that lasted for several years. I had low self-esteem. I was emotionally blunted, and the other kind of depression symptoms were also there. But by the time I started college, which is when I wrote this poem, I had broken out of that depression. And I had started to build my self-esteem, or more precisely, to rebuild it, if you will. And this poem is reflective of that process. So it's not simply an affirmation of the beauty within me, but it's also reaffirming that I have value, that I have worth within myself that nobody else can take away. From that perspective, the tenuous, tentative self-esteem that I had built up to that point was being reinforced and strengthened by what this poem represented. And that is looking inward at myself and finding value and beauty. And so it marks that kind of tipping point where before that poem, I was still on shaky grounds, but after that poem, I was more firmly set with the self-esteem and so forth. And so in a very real sense, this marks that kind of psychological transition for me, because it wasn't the poem that did it. It was the changes that were going on in my life because I had started college, and that changed everything. And so that's where this poem is coming from. There's a lot of stuff like that that enters into poetry that the reader either cannot know or only has a limited understanding of it. So the meaning of this poem for me is much different than it would be for most people who read it. I hope you liked this video, and if you did, press the button for it and consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you for your time.